Tonight, Ramadan has begun, but Israel's assaults against Gaza have not stopped. That decision highlights a breakdown between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
He's hurting, in my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel.
Plus, national security takes the spotlight in the Senate. A look at what lawmakers learned are the biggest threats. And
we're talking about elective abortions being forced.
What constitutes a medically necessary abortion? And why some doctors fear the repercussions if they don't perform one. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. As Gaza's humanitarian crisis worsens tonight, no sign of a ceasefire. Good evening in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. Israel is charging ahead with its war against Hamas after the terror group it rejected a deal to pause fighting and free Israeli hostages. Today, Israel released new footage said to show IDF troops raiding terror cells in the Gaza city of Khan Yunis. It came as Prime Minister Netanyahu vowed to hunt down Hamas's leadership one by one. Over the weekend, President Biden expressed support for Israel's right to defend itself against the terror group, but also urged Netanyahu to do more to avoid civilian casualties.
He has a right to defend Israel, a right to continue to pursue Hamas, but he must pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost as a consequence of the actions taken. He's hurting, in my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel by making the rest of the world, it's contrary to what Israel stands for. And I think it's a big mistake. So I want to see a ceasefire. And I'm starting with a major exchange of prisoners for a 6-week period. We're going into Ramadan. It should be nothing happening. And we should build off of that ceasefire.
Netanyahu rejects Biden's criticism and says most Israelis support his policies in Gaza. Meanwhile, airdrops of humanitarian aid continue to fall over the bombed-out strip as aid groups warn starvation is a growing threat there. International observers are concerned that religious tensions around Ramadan could escalate and spark violence in Jerusalem and beyond. Well, Israel and Washington stand at a diplomatic crossroads. The Jewish state says the city of Rafah is key in finishing its war against Hamas. But concern about civilian lives means the U.S. may not let Israel use American weapons in that fight. Chris Mitchell brings us that story from Jerusalem.
In his State of the Union address, President Biden put the burden on Israel to protect Gazans.
Israel has an added burden because Hamas hides and operates among the civilian population like cowards, under hospitals, daycare centers, and all the like. Israel also has a fundamental responsibility, though, to protect innocent civilians in Gaza.
In order to increase humanitarian aid into Gaza, the administration announced plans to build a pier in Gaza. Senator Marco Rubio pushed back on that idea on Fox News.
The only people on the ground with any organization to distribute things are Hamas. So in essence, can they guarantee that we're going to go through all this trouble, put American lives on the line, just so aid can be distributed to Hamas, who in turn will then control it like they've controlled everything? There's no Hamas fighters starving to death, and Hamas has no history, none whatsoever. They have zero history of ever helping civilians or people. So this is all for show, and it's dangerous.
Rubio says the fastest way to get aid to Gaza is to defeat Hamas. It's a goal Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged to IDF soldiers at a graduation ceremony, saying Israel had to take out the last Hamas stronghold in Rafah.
Whoever tells us not to operate in Rafah is telling us to lose the war, and that will not happen. There is international pressure, and it is increasing. But it is precisely when the international pressure increases that we must close ranks among ourselves. We must stand together against the attempts to stop the war. This is what the psalmist says, "Who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle." But today, we have a clear goal, achieving total victory in the war.
In what would be a major move, the Biden administration appears to be considering restricting the use of U.S. munitions if Israel launches a military operation into Rafah. David Ignatius of the Washington Post quoted former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk. If Israel launches an offensive in Rafah, without adequately protecting the displaced civilian population, it may precipitate an unprecedented crisis in U.S.-Israel relations, even involving arms supplies. Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, tells CBN News that would play into the hands of Hamas.
I think it's very irresponsible of the United States because President Biden himself and Secretary Blinken have both said that they understand Israel's need to eliminate Hamas, and to do that, they've got to go into Rafah. If they don't destroy Hamas in Rafah, then effectively Hamas have survived and will have won the war. They will declare victory. There will still be a major threat to Israel.
Meanwhile, the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, is reportedly holding up the negotiations for a ceasefire and the release of the remaining hostages. The Wall Street Journal reports Sinwar believes Hamas has the upper hand in the talks because of the splits in the Israeli war government and divisions between the U.S. and Israel. So he's demanding a permanent ceasefire and a pullout of all Israeli forces from Gaza, conditions Israel won't accept. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
All right, thank you, Chris. Well, right now is a sacred time for Muslims around the globe. Nearly 2 billion faithful are observing the Islamic holy month of Ramadan. It's a time when Muslim families fast from food and water every day from sunrise to sunset. The observance is meant to help worshipers draw closer to God. Some followers of Christ believe they also have a role to play. Transform Iran is one of many Christian ministries calling on Christians to pray for Muslims during Ramadan.
They're thinking about spiritual things. They're exploring their own relationship with God. So there's an openness that is different to all other times of year. So we should be fueling that and praying that God would meet them as they seek him.
Ramadan runs from today through April 8th. Turning to the Caribbean, where growing violence has Haiti on the verge of collapse. The U.S. military is now evacuating non-essential embassy personnel. Calls are increasing for foreign intervention to stop the violence before a humanitarian catastrophe unfolds. Caribbean leaders called an emergency meeting today with the United States, Canada, and France in an effort to stop the worsening gang violence in Haiti. But Pentagon officials have already said U.S. intervention is currently unlikely. And the U.S. has asked the Haitian Prime Minister to resign. Meanwhile, the violence has caused thousands to flee Haiti, heading instead to the neighboring Dominican Republic. On Capitol Hill, intelligence officials unveiled a new worldwide threat assessment today. From the war in Europe to concern over Chinese attacks on critical infrastructure or bad actors crossing our southern border, it's clear the world remains a dangerous place. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke joins us now with more from today's Senate hearing. Caitlin, were there any surprises in this year's assessment?
Jenna, I wouldn't say any of the threats shared were new concerns, but there are some issues that are more pressing this year than in the past. For example, threats to the 2024 presidential election. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are all looking to interfere. And according to intelligence officials, AI is making it easier than ever to spread misinformation.
With the advent of generative AI, states and non-state actors who are interested in conducting foreign malign influence operations no longer need to master a language to create potentially believable false content. The threat of malign actors exploiting these tools and technologies to undercut U.S. interests and democracy is particularly potent as voters go to the poll in more than 60 elections around the globe this year.
Expected to increase its efforts to compete technologically with the U.S., fielding more advanced technologies and platforms, and increasingly stealing intellectual property.
Chinese leadership is furthermore pursuing a strategy to boost China's indigenous innovation and technological self-reliance, expand their efforts to acquire, steal, or compel the production of intellectual property and capabilities from others, including the United States, and continue to engage in coercive behavior to control critical global supply chains of relevance.
So, Caitlin, we know immigration reform is a major topic being discussed in Washington right now, and of course, as we head into 2024 and the election in November, where threats coming from the U.S. on the southern border mentioned it all today.
Intelligence officials brought up the amount of fentanyl coming through the U.S. southern border and said reducing the threat of illicit drugs remains a priority as the health and welfare of Americans is at risk.
Transnational criminal organizations and human smuggling operations increasingly exploit migrants through extortion, kidnapping, and human trafficking. And in particular, the threat from illicit drugs remains at historic levels, with Mexican transnational criminal organizations supplying and moving large amounts of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, into the United States.
And Caitlin, what about Russia's war in Ukraine? Is there concern that that could affect U.S. national security?
One of the major concerns is that Putin sees Western support of Ukraine as feeding into his belief that the West seeks to restrict Russian power and undermine him.
We remain concerned that Moscow will put at risk long-standing global norms against the use of asymmetric or strategically destabilizing weapons, including in space and in the cyber domain.
The growing cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea is also of concern.
This growing cooperation and willingness to exchange aid in military, economic, political, and intelligence matters enhances their individual capabilities, enables them to cooperate on competitive actions, assists them to further undermine the rules-based order, and gives them each some insulation from external international pressure.
Despite the increasing nature of these partnerships, the intelligence community does not believe they will become a formal alliance. Jenna?
All right, national security correspondent Caitlin Berg, thank you. Well, President Biden unveils his plan for the budget. Coming up, we break it down and what it includes. Welcome back. President Biden unveiled his 2025 budget today. The big money wish list outlines priorities for a potential second term, including more taxes on the rich and social services for those struggling with high consumer costs. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us now with what's in the budget plan. Matt, it seems like the president's priorities haven't changed too much in this election year.
Oh, Jenna, the president's budget is doubling down on one of his main 2024 campaign themes, taxing the wealthy and seeking to prop up the middle class. There's also money for the border, but not as much as the Biden administration wants. The proposed $7.3 trillion budget went to Congress Monday. The budget includes a maximum $10,000 tax credit for middle-class first-time homebuyers, capping the cost of insulin for everyone to $35 a month, billions for green jobs and climate change research, and to offset those costs, $5 trillion in new taxes for corporations and high earners. One key element addresses border security to the tune of $4.7 billion in new funding. Biden continued to push Monday for a bipartisan bill that died earlier this year in Congress. It provided more money for patrol agents and border resources.
This bill would save lives, bring order to the border. It has the funds that many of our cities badly need as well. It would also give me, as president, new emergency authority or any other president, temporarily shut down the border when a number of immigrants is overwhelming it to regain control of the border. Border Patrol Union endorsed it. The Federal Chamber, the National Chamber of Commerce endorsed it. And I believe, given an opportunity, the House and Senate have the votes to pass it if they just bring it to the floor and vote on it.
The budget is an extension of many priorities Biden presented in his State of the Union. Like many presidential budgets, it has very little chance of passing a divided Congress as presented. Economist David Bahnsen is skeptical about some of the proposals fixing problems they aim to solve.
To go in and say we're going to give a $10,000 tax credit to first-time homebuyers doesn't do anything for supply, but it does feed demand. And demand pushes prices higher, not lower. So it's a great example of government going to do something, perhaps with good intentions, and it being counterproductive.
In response to the budget, House Republican leadership, including Speaker Mike Johnson, released this statement reading in part, quote, Biden's budget doesn't just miss the mark, it's a roadmap to accelerate America's decline. Jenna?
Matt, has the House GOP offered up an alternative?
Yes, they have. Just last week, House Republicans approved their own budget plan, this one with sharp spending cuts in many of the areas opposite of the president's priorities. The plan looks to balance the budget in 10 years, but again, in a deeply divided Congress, the House Republican budget also has little to no chance of passing a Democrat-controlled Senate.
Jenna?
All right, Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka, thank you. Well, the 2024 race for the White House is in full swing. President Biden was in New Hampshire today after facing off with former President Trump at dueling rallies in Georgia over the weekend.
It's not hyperbole to suggest our freedoms are literally on the ballot this November.
The border is the biggest problem. I think it's one of the biggest problems, the greatest threat to the history of our country.
Voters in Georgia, Washington, Mississippi, and Hawaii will hit the polls tomorrow, likely handing both candidates the delegates they need to officially become their party's presumptive nominees. A new ABC % of Americans trust Trump to lead the U.S. 33% trust Biden. 30% say they trust neither candidate. All right, a Texas case takes on abortions deemed medically necessary. Why some doctors fear they could face blowback for refusing to perform the procedure. Faith Nation returns in just 2 minutes. The Supreme Court is set to consider whether the federal government can require emergency room doctors to perform abortions. The question centers on what constitutes a medical emergency when it comes to performing the procedure. Charlene Aaron explains why a lack of clarity concerns both women and doctors, including some in the pro-life community.
The Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act requires hospital emergency rooms to provide medical care and stabilization for all patients. The White House wants that measure to include abortion access, even in states where the procedure is banned. As the High Court hears arguments over the issue, pro-life doctors are holding out hope for another victory.
We're talking about elective abortions being forced on doctors to perform them by a federal fiat.
Roger Severino of the Heritage Foundation says deliberate misinformation surrounds the law, also known as EMTALA.
There are some circumstances where you do have conditions where the life of the mother is at risk, and doctors are still able in every pro-life state to save the life of the mother, even if it incidentally results in the loss, tragically, of an unborn child. That's not what we're talking about here.
Under the law, hospitals that receive Medicare funds must provide emergency medical care. The Justice Department argues abortions can fall under emergency medical care, so healthcare providers should perform them. Earlier this year, a federal appeals court ruled Texas doctors aren't obligated to perform abortions under the law. The ruling followed numerous lawsuits from women who live in Texas, Tennessee, and Idaho, saying due to their state's bans, they were denied abortions despite having dangerous pregnancy complications.
The state doesn't care about the lives of their constituents.
Last summer in a Texas courtroom, women testified the state's abortion ban put their lives at risk.
I had just been given the worst news of my life. And I was terrified.
18 weeks into her pregnancy, Amanda Zarowski's water broke. After developing sepsis, she says she nearly died. While a number of states with abortion bans allow for exceptions if the mother's life is in danger, many experts say it's not clear when those exceptions can be applied. Dr. Susan Bain, board member of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, told CBN News clarification is vital.
I do think that physicians, other healthcare practitioners, it is the responsibility of hospital systems, the legal system, to make sure that doctors and healthcare practitioners really understand the law, because we're not attorneys.
Severino argues that abortion activists are using the issue to spread fear among pregnant women with health challenges.
It's politically convenient for the left that is very pro-abortion to try to scare people. There are so many instances of pro-life doctors who are out there saying, look, we do this all the time, we're OBGYNs, we know the tough cases.
The most common ones we see, I already talked about preterm rupture of membranes, but also hemorrhage, and then high blood pressure that's severe enough, something called preeclampsia or eclampsia. When we intervene for medical emergencies, we can do it without an abortion. We can separate the mom and the baby, but our intention is to hopefully have two living individuals when we're done.
Bain adds today's politically charged environment also makes decisions challenging for any doctor.
We've really seen a movement in our profession of OBGYN to where instead of doing our jobs of taking care of both, the answer to any risk factor is, well, go ahead and have an induced abortion and just eliminate the risk factor. And I'm like, time out.
Severino points out training is now required for many med students.
This is a sad thing. Now we see this in medical schools, where the accrediting bodies are saying you have to train in abortion to get a medical license. So students are being forced to assist in these abortions. They're trying to move it instead of a opt-in as an opt-out to pressure medical students to do abortions when the overwhelming majority of the profession, they went into medicine to save lives, not to end lives.
Meanwhile, Severino says if doctors are forced to violate their consciences by performing abortions, many of them will quit practicing medicine altogether. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Thank you, Charlene. And still ahead, an act of kindness on one continent that will be felt across the ocean on another. We explain right after this. Finally tonight, an act of kindness is sending a campus security guard all the way from Rhode Island across the globe to Nigeria. A group of Providence College students learned their overnight security guard, James, had not seen his family in more than a decade. That news sent them into action, organizing a GoFundMe account that raised over $6,000 to send James to Nigeria in June. Here is James's heartfelt reaction.
So, our gift to you is a trip to Nigeria. So
I pray from the bottom of my heart that God will continue to protect you guys.
And the students say they consider James family. Good for them and good for James. We wish them all well. And thank you for joining us for Faith Nation. That's going to do it for tonight. Have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.